Hi, I'm James Naylor Green, professor of Brazilian history and culture at Brown University and the national co-coordinator of the U.S. Network for Democracy in Brazil. This program is supported by the Washington, Brazil office. This is Brazil Unfiltered. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Peter Kornbluh, who is a senior analyst at the National Security Archive in Washington, D.C., where he has worked since April of 1986. He currently directs the archive's Cuba and Chile documentation projects. He was a co-director of the Iran-Contra documentation project and director of the archives project on U.S. policy towards Nicaragua. From 1990 to 1999, he taught at Columbia University as an adjunct assistant professor of international and public affairs. He is the author of Back Channel to Cuba, The Hidden History of Negotiations Between Washington and Havana, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2014, a Foreign Affairs Best Book of the Year, and the Pinochet File, a declassified dossier on atrocity and accountability, which the Los Angeles Times selected as the best book of the year. Congratulations, Peter. His articles have been published in Foreign Policy, The Nation, the New York Review of Books, The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times. He has worked on and appeared in numerous documentary films, including the Oscar-winning Panama Deceptions, the History Channel's Bay of Pigs Declassified, The Trial of Henry Kissinger, and most recently, the Netflix documentary Crack, Cocaine, Corruption, and Conspiracy. He also was on a documentary that I also was on called A Day That Lasted 21 Years, which was about the 1964 coup in Brazil. Peter, welcome to Brazil Unfiltered.
Oh, it's just a pleasure to be here, Professor Green. I so enjoy talking to you about these issues.
Great. So we're approaching the 60th anniversary of the March 31st, April 1st Brazilian military coup of 1964, which was followed by authoritarian coups in Chile in 66, in Argentina in 66, Bolivia in 1971, Uruguay in 73, and the more well-known September 11th coup of 1973, in which Salvador Allende was overthrown by Augusto Pinochet, then followed by the Argentine dictatorship in 1976. These repressive regimes marked a low point in democratic regimes in South America, as we shall discuss today. So first of all, Peter, what is the National Security Archive and what does it do?
The National Security Archive sounds like it could be the private library of the Central Intelligence Agency, but it's actually the leading advocate of freedom of information and access to information and the right to know that we have as U.S. citizens, the right to know that Brazilians have as Brazilian citizens and Chileans have as Chilean citizens, et cetera. We can't really have an informed electorate or a real democracy if the citizens of our countries are not informed. And so many things that the government does takes place in secret. We need to know what our government has done in our name, but without our knowledge. And that is the mission of the National Security Archive. We basically do three things. We are an archive. We gather together documents on countries like Chile and Brazil and U.S. policy towards the Latin America region. We index those documents and create collections that students and professors can use. We are also the kind of leading advocate around the world of freedom of information, working with other advocacy groups and governments around the world to create freedom of information laws. And finally, and this is more what I spend my time on, finally, I think we are what I like to call forensic historians. We dig up the secret documents, we excavate them from where they've been buried, and we make them part of history, and we give them, particularly those that concern human rights issues, to the victims' families, to the judges, to the lawyers, to the press, to make sure that this history, and particularly histories of repression, are known and used in both historical and judicial pursuits. And that's what the archive does and is.
Peter, I know this is a long answer to a question I'm going to ask you, but I'm very curious to know how you got involved in the interest about archives, documentation, the security issues, human rights. What's the story there?
Well, as I think you know, I've recently participated in the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile last September. talking to a lot of groups, a lot of reporters, a lot of officials about that history and what really happened, contributing to the debate over that history that took place. A lot of people ask me how I got my start in this. And of course, the answer is a Chilean girl, a Chilean woman, una chilena, and who I met in my Michigan high school the day after the coup, 50 years ago, September 12th. I met her on the morning of September 12th, 1973, a Chilean girl whose parents were teaching at the University of Michigan. It was from her that I first saw the horrors of the overthrow of the Allende government, the fears that it had generated. And she worked on the issue of Chile. We got together. We pololos, as the Chileans say. We got married. We had a son. We got divorced. All those things. But while she worked on Chile, I tried to work on what U.S. policy towards Chile had been, and the U.S. role in the overthrow of Allende and the advent of the Pinochet dictatorship. And literally now it's been 50 years of that work, and it's expanded to other countries, Nicaragua, Brazil, Cuba, and elsewhere. And now it seems, 50 years ago it began, and 50 years later, it's, looking like it's coming to an end. But it's been incredible work, and I've got to meet incredible people, including yourself.
So, Peter, what are some of the main challenges you've learned over the years for investigating documents about Latin American dictatorships? What have been the most difficult things for you to have to deal with in getting this information?
Well, there's so many factors that are difficult. For one thing, in countries like Brazil and Chile, the documents from their own militaries and their own intelligence and secret police services have disappeared, just like so many victims. And it's almost impossible to get Chilean documents, Brazilian documents out. There are some, but very few. And I had the incredible honor of meeting the president of Chile, Gabriel Boric, when I was there for the 50th anniversary. And we were talking about a new plan that he had just announced, the Plan de Búsqueda, it's called, which is a major state-backed effort to find the still 1,500 or so disappeared Chileans. Oh. And I asked him, why can't you just order the military to give you the documents on what they did with them? I literally had the opportunity to sit with him face to face and say, why can't you simply tell the military as president of this country that you want the records of what they did with those people? And he, admitted that, of course, he had discussed this with them, with the military leaders many times. They insist that they've already given all the documents that they have no more documents, that they destroyed the documents, that they don't know. And to order them to do this and then have no response would, not be a particularly effective thing to do. So it's a very difficult thing, and that, of course, is replicated in other countries,
including Brazil.
I remember when Lula was president for the first time, he decided not to issue a decree to the military to release documents on the repression during the dictatorship. He preferred to have the Congress pass a law mandating the military to do that. And he flew a bunch of us in to Brasilia to kind of help draft that law. This was a number of years ago. And the law created the Truth Commission and started that investigation, which, of course, some Brazilian documents showed up, but really a lot of the Truth Commission had to rely on anecdotal testimonies, interviews, and some declassified U.S. documents, which we were able to get for them.
So, Peter, it's pretty well known now that the United States was very much involved in overthrowing the democratically elected government in Brazil in '64, the Salvador Allende government in '73, did not have a good record 50, 60 years ago in terms of supporting democracy in Latin America, and in fact, ended up supporting dictatorial regimes. What have been your findings? What have been the findings of the National Security Archive around the U.S. involvement in the authoritarian regimes in Latin America in the 1960s and 70s?
Of course, this is an obstacle to getting the history out that I should have, added. It's not only that we want Brazilian documents and Chilean documents, we want U.S. documents, but because a number of these operations to overthrow governments, regime change, as it's now called since the administration of George Bush Jr., the regime change operations are often done covertly with the CIA, and getting the CIA to release those documents is very, very difficult. The CIA engineered an exemption to the Freedom of Information Act in the early 1980s. It got Congress to exempt it from being forced to even reply to requests for documents on these kinds of operations. And the only way these documents have surfaced is through Senate and House and congressional investigations, and through the mandate of various presidents who have been concerned and courageous enough to order special declassifications of documents. The United States is the hegemonic power, or was at least during, from the 1800s through to more recently in the region of Latin America. And it basically decided from one administration to the next, going all the way back to, the Monroe Doctrine, that it was U.S. influence that should play the controlling role in the region, and every other influence from outside, including internal influences, be damned. And the United States basically, I believe, exercised a might makes right type of approach to the smaller countries of the region. That got very complicated after World War II, when it was easier. Let me just say, it was easier before World War II. It was easier for the United States to just conduct what was called gunboat diplomacy. If we didn't like a government that came to power in countries like Nicaragua or Haiti or Cuba or Mexico, we would send in the Marines or just position boats off the coast in the Caribbean region as a display of power and displeasure, and put in, install the person we wanted. That got more complicated after World War II, when the United States and so many other countries helped create the United Nations, signed on to international legal commitments and declarations of respect for sovereignty for other countries and non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries. And then, of course, the United States created the Central Intelligence Agency so that it could continue to influence and intervene in the internal affairs of other countries, but have what presidents called a plausible denial of that type of policy. So in the case of Brazil, in the case of Chile, and so many other countries, these tensions were done largely through the Central Intelligence Agency. It's been very hard to get the records out. In the case of Brazil, I think the CIA, much like the dictatorship, has destroyed a lot of its documents, and it's been very hard to get them out. In the case of Chile, it was somewhat different. That became a scandal almost immediately. The U.S. Senate launched an investigation very quickly, and secured, or at least saw, quite a few documents early on that became part of the famous Church Committee report, a report named for Senator Frank Church, who headed a select committee in the Senate that investigated not just U.S. operations in Chile, but the whole Central Intelligence Agency for the first time, as well as the FBI and other intelligence parts of the intelligence community. So we know a lot more about Chile in some ways, and have continued to learn more about Chile because it hit such a nerve all the way back 50 years ago, and that has not ended. There's still a great deal of global attention and interest in Chile. And over the years, the issue of bringing Pinochet to justice and his henchmen to justice has been something that has been debated and part of the deliberations and policy approach to U.S.-Chilean relations that continues to yield new records, even as recently as last September.
So the Washington, Brazil office, working with human rights organizations in Brazil and the support of recent presidents of the Brazilian Historical Association, AMPU, is organizing a campaign to request that the Biden administration declassify key documents related to the Brazilian dictatorship, especially related to the coup and events surrounding it. Could you tell us a little bit about your efforts to get documents about the Chilean coup released during the Clinton and later the Obama administrations? And then more specifically, the success you've had recently with the Biden administration?
Well, that's a long, rich, complicated, and intriguing history. But of course, the work on Chile was aided considerably by the international human rights efforts to bring Augusto Pinochet to justice. The name Pinochet became synonymous with human rights violations. And when he finally was forced from power and made himself a senator for life so that he would be immune to prosecution, protected from prosecution in Chile, there was a major international effort, in part led by this extraordinary Spanish lawyer named Juan Garces in Madrid, to track him down and bring him to justice. And the opportunity came when he was in London in the fall of 1998, October, having back surgery at a private clinic there, and acting under the European Anti-Terrorism Convention. A Spanish judge asked for Pinochet to be detained because of his role in what's known as Operation Condor, which Brazil was part of as well, kind of a multilateral, repressive secret police effort to track down opponents around the world and eliminate them. And Pinochet was arrested under that convention, and then extradition papers were filed through Interpol for crimes against humanity, and he became a prisoner, placed under house arrest while these legal operations played out in London for over a year. And that year changed everything. I mean, his arrest changed the history of the human rights movement as we know it. There was a new lexicon, a new word in the lexicon of the human rights work, to be Pinochet, a new verb, because the whole concept of universal jurisdiction, of countries outside the country where the human rights crimes had taken place, actually stepping in to try and hold a human rights violator accountable. That concept really expanded with the arrest of Pinochet. It applied to Pinochet in London. It was quite the moment. And with him outside of Chile, for the first time, the Chilean press started to actually report on the truth of what he had done. And we seized this opportunity. A number of his victims who lived in the United States, the family of Orlando Letelier, family of Ronnie Moffett, both of whom were killed by the Chilean secret police in a car bombing in Washington in 1976. Joyce Horman, whose husband, Charlie, was assassinated, murdered, executed in the National Stadium days after the coup. Some of the prominent families of victims stepped in and started to push Bill Clinton. And my office also led an advocacy campaign, both kind of an inside strategy and a publicity strategy, to basically say to the Clinton administration, why would you want to protect this guy? You don't owe Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon anything. You should let the documents go on what the United States did in Chile, and you should release all the documents on Pinochet's human rights violations that the United States has been secretly holding for all these years. What better time than now to give the Spanish the evidence that they need to prosecute Pinochet for crimes against humanity? And Bill Clinton, to his great credit and the team around him, thought this was a good idea, and he issued a very, very strong kind of presidential decree ordering the bureaucracy, the secrecy bureaucracy, and the declassification bureaucracy to find all these documents, to review them, and release as many as they could. And it took almost 2 years the CIA kicking and screaming, refusing to release documents, being pushed and forced by, people inside the Clinton administration who understood that if the CIA didn't release their documents, then it'd just be a futile effort, the whole thing, and the Clinton administration would be accused of covering up kind of a U.S. role in human rights violations. Eventually we did get about 23,000 documents, including a couple of thousand CIA operational documents of their efforts to overthrow Allende and their early efforts to support the consolidation of the Pinochet regime. These were never before seen documents or never before publicized documents. They really changed the landscape of the broad 20-year history, 1970, 1990, of U.S.-Chilean relations with Allende and with the Pinochet dictatorship. They created a precedent for the release of other documents on countries like Argentina and Brazil. And they're still being analyzed today, decades after they were released. It's now been almost 23 years since those documents came out, and they're still invaluable. They've been added to. The Obama administration also did a special release of documents on the Letelier assassination, which showed explicitly that the CIA had concluded from its intelligence that General Pinochet personally ordered an act of international terrorism in Washington, D.C. that took the lives of Orlando Letelier and Ronnie Moffett. And that became invaluable material as well, which we should discuss why it's still relevant. But these documents have continued to come out. The Biden administration, for the 50th anniversary, released just 2 more documents. We had hoped they would release quite a few more that still are secret, but they only were able to release 2 that didn't much change the history of the U.S. role in the coup.
So how do you know about documents that are secret? How do you go about requesting documents that are secret? How do you find out that the document exists?
Well, you do the legwork of traditional scholarship, the type of historical work that you and I and your students and the people around me just do. You know what has happened over the years, and you familiarize yourself with what has been released, and you know that there are things that should have been released that weren't. You know that there were investigations into this and that, and we've never seen them. I am familiar with every congressional investigation into atrocities committed by the Pinochet regime and U.S. role in Chile, and I know what's come out of those and what hasn't. For example, Pinochet was discovered to be completely corrupt. He had stolen $28 million of Chilean state funds, and he'd put them in more than 100 secret bank accounts and offshore accounts using false passports and false aliases. And this was all discovered by a U.S. Senate investigation into money laundering and terrorism, quite appropriate for Pinochet, really. And a lot of it involved bank records. Those reports have lots of footnotes. We know which documents have been released, and we know from the footnotes which documents are still not out there.
So in this case,
one example. That's just one example of many, many.
So in this case, it's an example of a report being issued, and there being either things that were not declassified or indications that there's more material that it's in the archives that we don't have access to. We met actually around the time that I was founding the Opening the Archives project at the National Archive #2 in College Park, Maryland, where for the last 10 years, a group of Brown students have been going to the National Archive and scanning, indexing, and making available documents about Brazil during the military regime from 1964, but even actually going back to 61 all the way to the Reagan administration. And we have identified over 1,000 documents that have either been partially or entirely withdrawn from the archival availability for people who want to do that research. I'm sure there are many more. These are the ones that we were able to identify over the last 10 years of working intensively with State Department documents and Defense Department documents and other archival materials in the National Archive. I'm really curious to know what you would recommend as a strategy in terms of requesting from the Biden administration they release documents. What would you advise us to do? What's the best pathway forward? What would you say?
You know, it's an interesting history. The Truth Commission that was constructed during the first term of Lula did an official request to the Obama administration for documents, and got a relatively positive response. The bureaucracy resists spending a lot of time working on things for basically bureaucratic and resource reasons, not for any real political reasons. And not a lot of resources were put into the Brazil release. It really, most of the document, there were a couple of good State Department documents, but there weren't any intelligence documents released as part of that, really.
Let me jump in there just to kind of help refresh both of our memories. I think that the Truth Commission idea came through in the Gilman presidency, although it was discussed in the Lula presidency. It was actually a proposal in the Human Rights Conference in the Lula administration, but it was actually the Gilman did that, and the Truth Commission actually got from Biden at the second at her second inauguration
from Obama, yeah,
from Obama, exactly, in 2014. 680 some documents, as you just mentioned. But as we looked at them, and you did the same, there are very few that have really interesting new revelations to be told. Some of them have no idea how they managed to get into the mix, because there's totally one is I remember of the authorization to buy a tape recorder in Belém do Pará. Now, what they did with the tape recorder, who knows? But the only document that was there was that, please, could you let us have purchase of a tape recorder
and that's what I'm saying. For what your listeners don't remember, though, is that this incredible spy scandal broke. The NSA documents being leaked that showed that the United States had been spying on Dilma, including like hacking her cell phone.
Right.
And they were supposed to hand her these documents at a state dinner as part of what I call declassification diplomacy. And when the scandal broke, she canceled the dinner. She did not come to the United States.
Right.
And the documents were not shared with her at the time. And in fact, got to the Truth Commission somewhat after they had finished drafting their report. And 600 documents, I would say, is if that's 10% of what the United States actually has on U.S. role in Brazil and the repression of the Brazilian military, I'd be surprised if it's really any more than that. That the United States is still sitting on the vast majority of documents that it must have, and we know the difference because during the Obama administration, Obama ordered a special declassification of documents on Argentina that were just intelligence documents, not State Department documents, but CIA, FBI, Defense Intelligence Agency records, and NSC records. And those were incredibly revealing, as would a similar order on Brazil be revealing. And getting that order now, would be very difficult because there's less staffing, there's less resources, there's no budget, and you don't have an opportunity quite like the arrest of Augusto Pinochet in London. You have a 60th anniversary, and Lula's government should definitely make the case and make the official request for a gesture of declassification diplomacy. It shouldn't be for everything that's still secret. It should be more specific so that it's manageable. We found out in the case of the 50th anniversary of the coup in Chile that even a short list proved to be unmanageable. I'm glad that the U.S. Embassy in Chile made a really strong effort. I need to credit them for making a strong effort to press for the declassification of the documents that the Chilean government of Gabriel Boric asked for the 50th anniversary. But in the end, the Biden bureaucracy of secrecy only released 2 documents out of a list of, maybe 80 documents.
Interesting.
And so, you get a sense that it's just not that easy. So definitely we need to keep working to get every single page out, you and me and everybody else. But from what Lula could do for the 60th anniversary would be to provide a specific list of the most important episodes and issues that U.S. documents could shed light on, whether that's the coup itself, specific human rights cases that remain unresolved, Operation Condor issues relating to Brazil, etc. What's most relevant now is what's most important. And of course, Brazil is just now dealing with the issue of prosecuting its former president, Bolsonaro. Chile is in the throes of the rise of the right. The United States is suffering some of the same political issues. We need these documents because they shed light not just on a history, but on what's going on today and what could happen tomorrow. And we need to be reminded of the horrors of authoritarianism and military dictatorships so that all the countries involved, Brazil, Chile, the United States, and more around the world, remember that the Pinochet route and the military route and the authoritarian kind of, path to power is inimical to the interests of the vast majority of world citizenry. So that's why we need to continue to do this work. It's not just so that we know what happened in the past, so that everybody remembers that we don't want this to happen again in the future.
Absolutely. It's interesting. Our listeners, the people who subscribe to this podcast, or people who receive the Washington Brazil office newsletter, are very aware of the fact that the United States government was involved in the overthrow of the Goulart government in 1964. But they also followed the work that the WBO did in 2022, working very closely with civil society in Brazil to educate the U.S. Congress and the public, as to the extent possible, about the threat of Bolsonaro and the threat to the possibility of having an election overturned, as Trump tried to do in the United States. And Bolsonaro did attempt to carry out a coup 2 years and 2 days after the invasion of the Capitol on January 6, 2021. So it's clear that there's this change in policy from one of unquestionable support of the military taking power in 1964, and the Biden administration immediately recognizing the election results and congratulating Lula on his presidency. So the possibility of goodwill is theoretically there between the Biden administration and the Brazilian government of Lula da Silva. The question is whether will it be able to leverage the Biden administration in a very difficult electoral year to do something in this regard, because we're facing a very unfavorable situation in the United States. What would you recommend that be the pathway forward for our work?
Well, I would concentrate on two kind of parallel tracks. One is using the 60th anniversary as a peg to call attention to that past and to make the request to through the Brazilian government, if they're willing to do that, because that would make it official, trying to call as much attention to that request as possible. This is what we did in Chile. I went to Chile in January of last year, knowing that 9 months later would be the 50th anniversary of the coup. I met with the foreign ministry about them requesting documents from the United States as a gesture of declassification diplomacy. I did a long interview with the leading newspaper, La Tercera, about the documents that were still secret, the fact that other countries had collaborated with the United States, including Australia, in overthrowing Allende, and that record of history had never been released, and basically trying to highlight what was still secret. The Chilean Congress caught note of this message and drew up a resolution urging their government to ask the United States to release all the remaining documents on the U.S. role in the coup. I kid you not, it almost passed the Chilean Congress unanimously. And
wow,
Congress
amazing.
is polarized between left and right, but everybody,
right.
except for two senators, I think, were the only ones that voted against it. everybody wanted to see these records come out. So, the issue grew and grew and grew until the 50th anniversary. And I think that's the way you do it. You use the anniversary to create a momentum, a process, and a public pressure on this issue. At the same time, you start the longer term strategy, those withdrawal sheets that you have found in the archives. You look at those carefully, you see which ones seem to be important, and you use them. The mechanism is what's called a mandatory declassification review. You ask for every single one using those withdrawal sheets. But, as I say, the bureaucracy, because of the pandemic, has been really undercut. People left work, did not come back. The budgets were changed. Not enough people have been hired. It is an inexplicable and outrageous delay in getting these requests satisfied. I was at the Nixon Library 1 year ago this week, trying to get the remaining U.S. documents on Nixon and Kissinger's role in Chile released. And I was told that yes, these files that were still secret 50 years later, but it was going to take them 12 years to process my request. I was like, well, what kind of democracy are we living in that 50 years later, these documents are still secret, and you wanted to have another 12 years for them to be secret before you'll even, look at my request. And well, you have to. There's a long line and not enough people to review these records. That's the answer that I get given. But my organization is kind of pushing back against this and trying to find an avenue to get these documents. You could find a sympathetic voice in the Senate and in the House to push this also. And basically, you do need to try and get some kind of special release as if possible. And that 60th anniversary, which is, of course, just a few weeks from now, can be part of that. It certainly can start the ball rolling on that.
Peter, I want to just thank you so much for the fabulous vision that you've given us about how to do the work. And I hope that the WBO will be able to partner with the National Security Archive in future efforts in this regard. Even though both you and I are going into semi-retirement, I know neither of us is going to give up our passion for politics and our commitment to social justice in Latin America, in your case, primarily Chile, in my case, primarily Brazil. But I want to thank you so much for joining us on Brazil Unfiltered.
Well, it's a great honor. It's a great pleasure. I've learned so much from you, and I want to learn more. So let's get these documents out and do what we can.
That's wonderful. Well, I hope you enjoyed the interview. If you're watching on YouTube, don't forget to like the video. And if you have not yet subscribed, please do so. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. It helps other people find the program. Have a great week. Until next time, até a próxima.